Global environmental scan. So the way we scan the external environment, like the laws, economies, cultural values, etc., to seek opportunities or become aware of threats to buffer against. This is where you really cannot assume you just know the environmental factor. The gist of this section is you cannot take a shortcut and rely on your local knowledge. The book has tons of examples of conditions or assumptions we take for granted. The following is a set of examples, a taste, if you will, of ways these environmental forces may vary when looking to serve global markets. So, big idea is all the usual environments matter, but we especially take note of how culture, economy, and the political, legal, or regulatory is especially fraught. Here are some major cultural aspects we'll cover: values, customs, symbols, and language. So values and customs are especially important to learn. When we market domestically, many organizations can cheat a bit and rely on the organization's local knowledge of the local culture. Harder to get away with that when marketing elsewhere, unless you already have someone who's pretty steeped in it. Values are what a culture considers desirable. So same as the world over, there are systems or things or states of being we consider more desirable than others. So how much independence and interdependence, freedom for the individual, work versus leisure. All these values have a major impact on what types of consumption a customer might consider desirable. For example, many customers throughout the world have different prohibitions against types of consumption like meat, alcohol, gambling, and others. Other consumers feel it's important to do productive leisure, where they must feel like they made or learned something. Customs represents what's commonly done in a culture, what's normal or expected. So it's customary here that when you stand in an elevator, you don't face the person and stand really close to their space. Here's another. During Valentine's Day, who gives what and when? So in Japan and Korea, they have different traditions where chocolate is the traditional gift from women to their sweethearts. Almost. In Japan, you're expected to give to more men than just your sweetheart. Giri choco, obligation chocolate, is for those who you have to give it to. It's expected. Just because you get chocolate doesn't mean she actually likes you that much. If you get homemade chocolate, or homemade choco, then you know you got a more special place. Women get gifts 1 month later. As you can imagine, in the US, one is not likely giving away that many Valentines unless you happen to be in elementary school where you're expected to give one to each of your classmates. Customs are often influenced by these cultural values. For example, the types of consumption women or men are expected to know or like based on what is coded as feminine or masculine. There's a reason your book notes that in France, men wear twice the number of cosmetics than women do. The book expects its reader is from the US thus and would be surprised by this flip-flop of that student's home custom. A major set of customs are business customs. Etiquette is the generally accepted ways of behaving in social situations. In other words, the manners you were often taught to do as a kid or a young associate. Behaviors considered rude or obnoxious in one culture may be very acceptable in another. This can have a major impact to your ability to conduct business because you often need to work with global partners to actually sell your product, including government, distributors, promotional outlets, and so on. So it can be little things like when you say you'll try to get something, some groups will say and take it as, yeah, you'll try. Others are, that's pretty much you saying, yes, I'll get it for you. We have an editorial cartoon here showing some common examples, such as what to do with business cards, personal space, speech, and power distance. This 1-minute video here gives a few examples of what many of us take for granted. Whatever country or region you are a part of, never hurts to take a quick look at the types of ways you market yourself and your company. This is similar to an example we'll be going over later where Australians were laughing at the terrible fake-sounding Australian accent in an advertisement. It's dangerous to look like you cannot even take the time to do a bit of background research. After all, if you cannot get the little things right, how can they be sure you'll have the right foundations for more high-stakes risks? So a major part of the environmental scan is also cultural symbols. These are things that represent ideas, concepts, and other things for a specific culture. So for example, for the US, bald eagles, the Statue of Liberty, baseball, and apple pie have special meanings that represent the nation itself. However, symbols are more than just representative of a nation. They can also represent a particular story or idea that's important to a culture. For example, the number 13 is considered unlucky to many Westerners. The number 4 sounds like death in many East Asian cultures, so they avoid it. Therefore, you'll see many hotels, hospitals, and casinos eliminate one or both of those numbers. So you can see the pictures here is missing 4 and 13 and 14 for good measure. Next is an ad that a marketing agency made for Nippon Paint. To show the smoothness of Nippon Paint, they made it appear as if the dragon on the right pillar had slipped down and cannot grip the pole. However, the dragon is a cultural symbol very dear to the Chinese market, which represents power, wisdom, and their very nation. Many Chinese customers were not at all amused, especially since Nippon is a word that represents Japan, and there's still a bit of sordid history where Japan is especially not someone Chinese customers would allow any kind of teasing for national cherished symbols. A final example is related to what we discussed in customs, body language. How we talk or position our bodies can convey a great deal of meaning because we often see such movements as representing something. Here's an example where an accent can be considered a cultural symbol. The proponents behind the ad discussed in this commentary link, so you'd click it right here, lost a great deal of credibility because the narrator's Australian accent kept changing. The author of the opinion piece noted that many saw it as dipping into American quite often to the point of hilarity. The United States has accents too. In the United States for years the mid-Atlantic accent was considered standard, but today it sounds a lot like period pieces of the 1940s and 50s. If you're curious, it's a lot what characters from Frasier and Niles sound like in the TV show Frasier. This was not even an accent of any particular region. Later on, a type of English often called newscaster English became the common way, the common accent, so to speak, because newscasters around the country used it, and it became more common where the accents are supposed to be neutralized. Today it's shifted to what's called General American, which sounds a bit like Western Regional English without the cowboy or surfer dude accents, likely due to the influence of a whole bunch of media being produced here in California. Meanwhile, if someone uses a Californian, Southern, Bostonian, or Midwestern accent, we tend to make inferences about who they are and their personality beyond simply thinking, oh, they happen to be from that area. And as you can imagine, the South is a giant place. There are differences between those from Georgia, Texas, Alabama, and Kentucky, and they'll laugh at you too, just as all the Australians did, if you switch around thinking it all just happens to be one Southern accent. One final thing to keep in mind. While Americans have a sense what might be a standard American accent, other cultures may have a very different impression what the standard American should sound like. So in sum, an accent is more than an accent. It can symbolize other ideas that your customers may use to better understand your point. Make sure it actually is meant to work with your point. Accents, in fact, give us a good segue into our next discussion, language. So language is made up of the words we use, the way we put together sentences, the slang we might use, the speed in which we talk, how pronounced certain sounds are, and so on. Beyond just accents, many regions or cultures tend to produce their own words, slang. Cultures love figurative language like idioms or use stories to convey different ideas. Some places may even have regional dialects, where it's an offshoot of the primary language. It pays to often get translators who actually know the regions. For example, if you ever picked up an official school book teaching language, the language is often very stilted and very formal. So for example, you can imagine if someone wrote up a commercial and used a dictionary. You have a morning encounter between two neighbors walking their dogs, and one says, "Greetings, Mr. Jones. How are you today?" "I am very well, thank you. And yourself?" It's a translation of what might be going on, but it's not very faithful to how people actually speak. It would be hard for the audience to take it seriously. We're likely expecting a twist to the commercial that shows why they sound so odd and stilted. Same goes for dozens of other languages. Even if the official language may be the same, such as English, French, Spanish, or Mandarin, regional differences in slang still prevail. One nice thing for Americans, though, is that most other countries do learn English. However, it's in your best interest. Make sure your translations work and that you do the regional dialects when appropriate. To try to avoid stilted or hilariously bad translation, we often engage in what's called back translation, where you have native speakers actually double check what it will actually sound like and what it actually means. So here we go. So there's some examples for pictures. Australian Overwatch players were miffed when the sign originally said take out, whereas their use of the word takeaway. Still in English, but idioms and slangs matter. And here's an example of back translation. To make sure the translation actually works, it really helps to make sure stop staring at my boot and stop looking at my rear. Different words. Finally, Kit Kat in Japan is an example of how people love wordplay. Kit Kat has a double meaning, but fortunately for Kit Kat, surely win is a positive meaning that resonated with its customers. In sum, remember to be super careful with language. It's never just one. Language is always changing, and customers love playing with words. As we saw with Kit Kat, this may even work in our favor. It's just a matter of resonating with your customers. So just to get a bigger sense of the variation within a single language, take a look at some of these quizzes. There are pronunciations that I never knew could be different and slang that I've never heard of. For one example, I grew up in sunny California. We didn't really need a word that represents when it's sunny and rainy at the same time very often. Take a look. You might find that even if you've never lived in a particular region, your vocal characteristics may be influenced by the people you grew up with. My spouse ended up with many characteristics of Michigan English because he grew up in a community that had roots there, even though his own family hailed from the East Coast and he was raised in the West. Just imagine how much variation there is between countries when their own country likely has all of its own major variations within. A second major consideration that we'll now go over is economic consideration. So we of course still care all about the things we mentioned in Chapter 3, such as GDP, recessions, job numbers, and consumer income. Now we need to really take into specific considerations, though, the infrastructure, the currency exchange rates, and other things like that, because it's so easy to fall into assumptions of what it's like for your country of origin. You might make some major errors. So first, you need to take special interest in the infrastructure. This is the nation's communications, transportation, financial, and distribution systems. How are they structured? What's credit like? What types of TV do they have? What types of public transit? This will influence how you can actually communicate to your customers, find financial partners, or actually get your product to your customers. For example, the way people access TV or internet may be very different. The speed in which you can transport your products may be affected. Financial services will influence how people pay for things, or how business partners acquire funding. Here's another example. In the US, video game companies often have a few major retailers like GameStop, Best Buy, Amazon, and now Steam. They may need to go through to get, and there's not that many retailers that they need to get their video games to the majority of customers. For Brazil, many of their retailers who might distribute games are numerous and comparatively small. So it might be much more difficult to access the bulk of Brazilian customers. This is likely to change as digital access becomes more common and interested business groups organize to make it simpler for video game companies to connect with Brazilian retailers. Here next are 2 examples of how communication infrastructure differences lead to different opportunities. Let's talk live streaming. Live streaming is where someone is recording and broadcasting things in real time, and often there are tools that allow users to interact with the live streamer, like a chat window or ability to send notes and emojis. So, like right here, you'd be going chat, 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 emoji, emoji, emoji. In China and other parts of East Asia, more generally, live streaming is huge compared with the US, and interactivity is much more expected. It's a way to earn trust and really show the value offering for savvy customers who want to make sure they get the best. So there's lots of apps and services like Uns and Shops to help coordinate live streams to connect customers with businesses. More general services like WeChat have customized their tools to help merchants as well. If you want, here's a very good video that talks about the landscape of Chinese customers looking to buy American goods, and in particular, some of the challenges boutiques looking to sell to those luxury customers might face. Her story is, of course, one of how her business aims to bring customers and merchants together beyond live streaming even. It's optional for now, but it's going to be much more required video during the retail section. Here's another example of infrastructure, mobile devices in African nations. We take for granted in the US that we have a prominent electrical grid, and so we could use bulky computers and cash registers because we could easily have electrical outlets and corded landlines and network cables wherever we needed them. Not so in many regions of Africa, where there can be hubs of people that still want to be connected and engage in economic transactions. This meant that the use of mobile devices and the ways they use them became much more common and even leapfrogged many Western nations. This particular video focuses on the use of mobile payment in Kenya, that the US we're only just getting to half the time with many of our apps. Right now, largest trends are number 1, search engines and other sites like Baidu or Facebook are trying to gain a foothold as this underserved market grows, and 2, we're still facing issues for how data is acquired and paid for. In places like Uganda, you can easily switch out SIM cards and therefore switch internet service providers. However, the harder part is the cost of data can be prohibitively expensive for large swaths of the population. As an end note, this also means that companies selling phones, of course, have to know what their customers already know or are looking for. If a bank comes in touting their micropayment app as if it's brand new, many customers will give them a well-deserved teasing. Here's another economic consideration. We of course remember from Chapter 3 that it's not just the dollar amount the customer has, but how much they have that they can actually spend and can do something with. The book has some great examples stressing that you need to do your research to see what the income actually means and what types of expectations for how they categorize your product. One major part of this is what's called the currency exchange rate. This represents the price of one country's currency in terms of another, and is usually discussed in terms of its movement, so whether it's declining or rising. In essence, a dollar is not just a dollar, peso, or yuan. So if you want, there are some examples in the notes section if you want to recap on what it means to do currency exchange rate calculations. So the final environmental scan that we especially focus on, especially for global markets, is the political regulatory climate. You can look at how our own nation is always in constant debate for how we should respond to people and policies. You of course need to look at the stability of the nation. The book encourages you to take a look at the PRS group, which evaluates risk. For example, Venezuela is going through an extreme economic crisis with massive food and public service failures. So next, we also need to consider the legal regulation of a firm may have on trade and the conduct of competitors and consumers alike. Many firms have to alter their marketing strategies such as considering stronger privacy policies, changing what or how they advertise, such as limits on when can something be advertised, and if the product is even allowed in said nation. As we will discuss, this may strongly affect how you decide to enter a country. Certain countries give more favorable treatment, say, to domestic firms or limit how much influence an outside firm can have. So you may want to engage in, say, a joint venture to reliably enter a market. Sometimes it might also be a matter of what the country can or will actually legally enforce that can impact a company's marketing strategy. In many nations, plagiarism and counterfeits may have varying levels of enforcement. China is part of the World Trade Organization, an organization that requires strict intellectual property regulations, but its system can slow the process for IPR holders. So for example, a sports apparel company in China called Uncle Martin looks suspiciously similar to Under Armour to the point that Under Armour took legal action. They did win their trademark dispute, in fact. So essentially, I do warn that not only do firms have to look toward the political regulatory climate, they must take into consideration the other practices and ideas that tend to come with it. So for example, a firm may at first believe the use of their marketing logo should always be counted as plagiarism. However, said firm must consider the motivations and end results of other processes. So for example, artists and other firms may remix, that is, cut and paste together different marketing-based images to make their own products. So for example, Indonesia has a booming indie shirt industry that makes good use of this technique. In many regions, this art style is traditional and very normal. Here's another example to get you thinking about the political and regulatory climate. In Latin America, piracy is considered to be very common. However, researchers have taken a closer look at the particular customers and contexts that tend to lead to more blasé attitudes towards using that informal market. Unlike customers from places with more public resources for buying or borrowing, many Latin Americans did not have even access to legal purchases or to the music culture more generally. It made it much simpler for these customers to shrug and turn right to that secondary market. So high-minded arguments are of little use to them and may even seem sillier when they instead could look to how they help their local community members make a living. So in a sense, piracy is not a very big deal if you're not treating them right in the first place. And they'll go and help their own community that are pirates, but it's their own. So in essence, practicing ethics is not a one and done deal. Gotta look at the climate, gotta look at the facts on the ground. Final quick little example is that external factors tend to intertwine and overlap. So in this case, for many in Hong Kong, the Cantonese language represents culture and political relations. It's not just language. So Nintendo, the maker of Pokemon, so here's Pikachu, is trying to standardize translations for local Chinese markets. Pikachu and other Pokemon are, in essence, being renamed due to the standardizing translations toward the Mandarin language versus Cantonese and other localized translations. Previously, they'd used different characters, the word parts, to make approximate sounds, but now they're trying to make sure everyone uses the same characters. But that does not always mean they sound the same anymore. So it made customers upset because many of them are used to the names they first learned. But more than that, it starts hitting cultural pride in the local language and culture. Many already feel the pressure of Cantonese or local dialect being pushed out for Mandarin. Not helping especially for those in Hong Kong is the pressures amongst these groups when agreeing on things like local governance with other parts of the Chinese, of the larger nation. So, want to learn more about a country or perhaps just what we take for granted in the U.S.? Comesico, sorry if I mispronounced that, Global has a nice selection of country profiles, quizzes, and other discussions on doing business. So, go ahead and click through these if you like, or you can go on and go to our next section where we talk entry strategies for global markets. So, I hope you're having a great day, and this is your instructor encouraging you to run with this, or, as said, click through and learn some more about different countries. Thanks.